So, welcome to the second part of our exploration on identity and design, in which we'll continue the discussion that we began in the first part. So, in our last conversation, we looked at certain examples across different fields of design: attire, architecture, toys, kitchen implements, and utensils, which we associate even today with being Indian. And we discovered some recurring themes that govern their making and invest them with certain attributes. Themes of flexibility and frugality, of sustainability and optimum efficiency, of an integration of decorative and functional attributes, and of individuality and improvisation. So the questions we were left with were, if these themes or attributes are seen to be Indian, then anything that has these thematic attributes should, by that logic, also be Indian. Does that mean that we will not encounter these anywhere else in the world? In other words, are these thematic attributes exclusive to India? Well, flexibility, frugality, sustainability, improvisation, optimal efficiency are, in my opinion, desirable and progressive principles anywhere in the world, irrespective of the profession we follow. To say that these are not found anywhere else but in India would be both incorrect and arrogant. However, when we observe and conclude anything, we do that on the basis of the rule rather than the exception. In India, we find that these attributes are commonly found through most of our existence, throughout the subcontinent, and across different scales of practice and domains of design. Based on this evidence, we can conclude that these are, therefore, defining attributes or lakshan of Indian design, of which architecture is an all important part. These were therefore the rule and not the exception. So, if we are to say that as a rule, anything that displays these attributes is Indian, how do we distinguish between objects or buildings made in India versus objects and buildings made in other parts of the world, which might also have these attributes and which may also be activated by these very principles? Is there then a contradiction in what we are saying? In other words, if these principles and attributes constitute Indian identity, how do we account for or recognize their presence elsewhere in the world? Well, one evident difference would be in the way these thematic attributes are addressed, that is, in their expression, which is a cultural standpoint. So even the idea of what is beautiful is not universal. People brought up in one culture may not consider aesthetically satisfying what people in another culture do. The way in which Indian sculpture was regarded by many Europeans as monstrous or ugly, when they first encountered them, an idea which persisted for many centuries, is one example of this. This, for instance, is the cover of a book titled The Adventure of the Strange Ruby, written by a popular children's author, Enid Blyton. It was published in 1960, though the cover of the edition that I'm showing you is from 1979. And this consists of an adventure centered around a group of Indian idols, which the children very candidly call frightful creatures. And this is the cover of The History of Indian and Eastern Architecture, a monumental work by James Ferguson. So Ferguson writes in the introduction to his book, and I quote, "It cannot, of course, be for one moment contended that India ever reached the intellectual supremacy of Greece or the moral greatness of Rome. But though on a lower step of the ladder, her arts are more original and more varied, and her forms of civilization present and ever-changing variety, such as are nowhere else to be found. So, despite the fact that Ferguson is a more sympathetic observer and writer than many other Europeans and colonial writers, he cannot put the arts of India or the intellectual capacities of India on the same plane as those of Greece and Rome, which are the cultural standpoints for the civilization that he comes from. And with respect to sculpture in particular, which he classifies as Hindu or Buddhist or Jain, this is what he has to say about what he calls Hindu sculpture. So he says, and I quote again, "The human figures, too, though very different from our standard of beauty and grace, are truthful to nature and, where grouped together, combine to express the action intended with singular felicity." End of quote. So therefore, we see that standards of beauty and grace are different in different cultures and affect how they see or respond to design, art, and architecture in their cultures and in other cultures. The other difference would lie in whether all or only some of these attributes are seen in cultures other than the Indian, and the frequency with which these occur. Thus, do they actually function as guiding principles that direct everything that is made, or are they incidental combinations and results? To explore these questions, I'm going to show some images of what I consider thoughtful pieces of architecture. All of them in India, but not necessarily designed by Indian architects. However, all of them are designed by architects who have made India their home, so that is common to them. But apart from the commonality of their larger physical location, is there anything else that ties them together? One aspect which may or may not be immediately apparent when we look at them, but is something we understand when we have an opportunity to use them or examine them in detail, is how they respond to their immediate context. They all seem to a certain degree contain the attribute of flexibility of use. Some of them directly use the courtyard or the pavilion or the veranda, the colonnade and the jali or the screen wall typology. Others use the concept of uncluttered space, which can therefore be used for multiple purposes. They thus also contain the attribute of utilizing and optimizing space efficiently and maximizing the range of use of the spaces. So we see that the Lakshana of flexibility, versatility, frugality, and efficiency is present in all of them to a certain extent. However, when we look at the attributes of sustainability and improvisation, these are not present to the same degree in all of them. For example, the Oshudham or the Triveni Kala Sangam, the dining hall at the Osho Center, etc., use a greater proportion of industrial processes and materials, such as steel, concrete, and stone, that may not be locally quarried. In comparison to, let's say, the Malka Center in Andhra Pradesh or the Laurie Baker House. As the P. Sayanath exhibition on the Pari site, the People's Archive of Rural India site, shows, the large-scale extraction and production of these materials causes great devastation to and exploitation of ecology and of people. Again, the fact that mechanized, large-scale industrial methods of producing raw materials for buildings are centralized systems implies that you mine huge amounts in one place, then move the raw materials to another place where they are combined in mechanized setups, which also use great amounts of energy and non-renewable resources to operate and to produce concrete or steel or cement. And finally, the finished products have to be transported to different areas to be sold and used. That is a huge carbon footprint that obviously makes the use of these materials unsustainable. So even if you're a skilled and thoughtful architect, the use of building materials produced by large-scale industrial processes that are inherently exploitative of the earth and other human beings, all living creatures, cannot be called sustainable. Though you can, of course, optimize your design to reduce their use as much as possible. Secondly, the use of such materials reduces and confines your domain of design interventions. Since the more industrialized, the so-called developed nations of the world use these materials and large-scale mechanization to a greater degree, naturally, the designs generated in those nations rarely show the Lakshan of sustainability and also offer reduced opportunities for everyone, including architects, to engage in multiple creative ways with their work. These are some stills from the Charlie Chaplin film titled Modern Times, released in 1936. And it shows how the ordinary worker is dominated by and even dwarfed by machines. Specifically for architecture, this dominance is reflected in a different way. So Mi Ji Yoon, in a conversation on the future of architecture and architectural education, as she prepared to take over as the head of Department of Architecture at MIT in 2014, identifies one of the great challenges today as, and I quote, the contraction of the architect's ability to intervene in the built environment, end of quote. She further adds later on in the interview, and I quote again, the construction industry is no longer as integrated with architecture as it was historically, when we had a relationship with craftspeople, because construction is now its own kind of industry, end of quote. So while you can be frugal and improvise even with the use of industrial materials, this will be limited to how you use these at a micro level in your site and in your design. You will rarely have control over the production of these materials. And just as the opportunity to control the production is least in the more industrialized parts of the world, it is less in the more urban parts of India as compared to smaller towns or rural areas of India. This is why the Malka Center or Uzra Bilgrami's house demonstrate the Lakshan of sustainability to a greater degree, generated by their use of local materials and skills, as well as a greater degree of frugality and improvisation and identity. Naturally, then, when we choose to use or are compelled to use industrial materials, we are automatically led to a reduced notion of identity of place. Since industrial materials depend on translocation, on production in large volumes that disregard customized individual requirements. In fact, modernism as a movement in the arts and architecture and design used the slogan of universal identity and sought to remove regional or national or local expressions of identity which they portrayed as backward or regressive. This is why buildings such as these that I'm going to show you could be anywhere in the world. Only the people, landscapes, and objects around them make us think of them as Indian. And that is probably why David Gentleman, whose book of drawings these are taken from, does not ever draw these buildings in isolation, but always with people in the foreground. This then brings us to another interesting question. Do we think of the architecture of the IIC as modern, or the Malka Center and Nusra Bilgrami's house, or the Osho Center? Is one more modern than the other? And as a corollary, which would you think of as more Indian? If we think of modern and its meanings of related to the present or recent times, the IIC is probably the oldest of these and therefore the least modern. If we think of modern as using the latest techniques and equipment, we may think of Oshodham as the most modern, even though it is more or less contemporary with the Malka Center and Usra Bilgrami's house. And if we think of modern as something marked by a significant break in traditional values, we may again consider ISA or Triveni or Oshodham apparently more modern than the other buildings, even though at least 30 years separate the construction of the ISC and the Oshodham, for instance. And based on such conventional notions, most of us may also think of these as less Indian than the Malka Center, even though they respond intelligently and appropriately to both the climate and geography they are located in, and contain guiding principles of flexibility and versatility, and therefore continue what may be termed the Lakshan of Indian designs. So the use of the word modern seems to be confusing, sometimes contradictory. And in design terms, it seems to be generally limited to appearances and values seen as not traditional and therefore not Indian. That is why we tend to dismiss the tradition of Indian design or designs generated from the Indian tradition as not modern. And because we assign a value system of progress and progressive to modern, many of us deliberately try not to look or sound Indian, either in dress or speech or appearance. So, this is an advertisement for a cream which is called Fair and Handsome. And the tagline is handsome bano, banda bano. So, handsome is equated to a certain value of fairness, which is obviously an imported sort of value. And as far as our buildings are concerned, we often design buildings that are either a deliberate break from the Indian tradition or that simply follow the lead of the current architecture of other industrialized nations, which are obviously not Indian. Naturally enough, such buildings will not demonstrate any Lakshan of being Indian, since they are deliberately trying to neither look Indian nor examine, investigate, or incorporate any principles that have been markers of Indian identity historically. The design interventions in them are generally limited to imitations or to minor changes in a bid to generate identity in virtually identical products. It is just incidental that they happen to be in India then, or are designed or constructed by Indians. So instead, let us relook at the work of architects and designers who are activated by the principle of making their designs context specific. And evidently, the context that we are talking about is the Indian context. So we find that by virtue of sympathetically and comprehensively responding to the context, which is the geographical, climate, and functional context of India, they intuitively continue certain Lakshan of Indian design. This happens even in cases where there is some intervention of large-scale industry, as in the processing of raw materials for construction. This is in the first instance due to individual talent and training. But apart from individual traits, there is also a cultural influence and a cultural context, which is consciously or unconsciously reflected. To understand what is this cultural context and the extent of its reflection, we will need to relook at the concept of Indian identity, not from an outsider's lens or from a borrowed framework, but from the inside, from a philosophy and a view that predates our colonial experience and to some extent still persists despite both imposed and internal changes. It is interesting that the generic term for philosophy in India is darshan, which literally means to see. It carries connotations, therefore, of seeing both as a process of rigorous examination as well as of surveying and understanding our place in the world. The Upanishads may be said to be some of the earliest instances of such rigorous examination and survey and understanding, at least in India. They contain and set forth ideas which are continued in various forms till today in India and its allied cultures, and which therefore affect how we see ourselves at a fundamental level. So, how did we and how do we see ourselves? And how is this different from other parts of the globe? One major difference is in the notion of space and time as cyclical rather than linear. We believe in recurring time and space cycles, which are held to have certain characteristics which get worse and more unstable the further we are from the center of time and space. Again, this is not confined to texts and philosophy or the beliefs of very early generations. Even today, we often use the phrase Ye Kalyug hai, to explain away the problems of our current epoch, which is believed to be the last in a repeating pattern of 4 yugs or epochs. The theme of Kalyug is also interpreted from various angles in popular and successful Hindi films, as in the 1981 award winning film directed by Shyam Benegal titled Kalyug. The conception of time and space that is intrinsic to such a belief is very different from the Darwinian notion of evolution along a linear time cycle and survival of the fittest, which justified the colonization of India and other parts of the world by Europeans, and which now makes it permissible to colonize even Mars and the moon. So, as you can see, this image offers acres of land on the moon for sale, and it's from a site called lunarland.com, which carries the tag of Earth's oldest, most recognized celestial real estate agency. Now, apart from the recurrence of time and space, we also tend to believe in the recurrence of our existence and the concept of rebirth according to our actions in this birth. Thus, values like frugality and sustainability, improvisation and flexibility are inherent in such a philosophy. They influence everyday habits and lead to lakshanas of collective responsibility and self-reliance and divergence and diversity. From the particularly Indian habit of jugaad to the particularly Indian concept of the kabadi wala. These lakshanas of Indianness, which are seen in our everyday thinking, are also seen in our design thinking, especially in a field like architecture, which deals directly with the use and interpretation of space. Or they should be seen if we are not actively thinking about them. These lakshanas were consciously continued as a pan-Indian system codified through classical shastras and transmitted through local practices among those who were heirs to this philosophical conception. It is this philosophical background that set apart and gave identifiable features to products of the Indian mind and so much value to frugality and flexibility. This is what sets these apart from buildings and products in other parts of the world. And we observe this even in the pre-industrial age, when craft was the de facto method of production all over the world, and when things like localization, customization, and sustainability were default traits. When architecture, in Mi Jiyun's words, had a relationship with craftspeople even in the West. In other words, the expression of architecture and design is not just a matter of aesthetics, but equally of ethics and value systems, which are unique to different cultures. And I would like to end, therefore, with some images of context-specific architecture from other parts of the world, which also respond to the culture and philosophy of their own regions, where the architects have engaged intensely with the process of building and improvised as they went along wherever possible, as well as interacted with the crafts and with the craftspeople of their regions. For us to reflect on how the expression of design is affected by and generated from the values that we hold important, both as individuals and as part of a larger societal, philosophical, and cultural context that we inhabit and inherit. Thank you.